Good afternoon. Glad for everybody being here again today. We're going to take a little bit of time today to deal with two additional assaults on marriage that we don't always think about in terms of assault. Last night we dealt with culture, and it's easy to understand that culture assaults Christianity in virtually every area, including marriages and families. I mean, our culture and society is about as diametrically opposed to Christian values as it could possibly be. So we understand that nature of assault. Today we're going to look at a couple of things that are a little bit different that we don't normally put into that same category, but we want to think about them. First, we want to talk about children and grandchildren. What kind of assault are children and grandchildren on marriage? Because God says such favorable things about children, and we're going to look at some of those things in a minute. I mentioned last night they had done a survey with a bunch of young children, and their responses to several things were very interesting. One of them, a young girl by the name of Kirsten, when they were asked in regards to how do you know who to marry, she responded, no person really decides before they grow up who they're going to marry. God decides it all way before, and you get to find out later who you're stuck with. So, concepts sometimes by the kids are very honest, very forthright, and maybe even things that they've heard, but don't always get the picture right. I like the guy that said this. He said, before I got married, I had 6 theories about raising children. Now I have 6 children, no theories. How many people can relate to that have 2 kids? I'm telling you, I knew a lot more about raising children before I had them. Anybody else with me on that one? Oh yeah, I lost a lot of knowledge when the first one was born, and especially when all 3 of them were born, and then it even got dumber by the time all 3 of them were teenagers. You just understand raising children is not an easy task. I've got this picture. It might be if you did this. Parenting, who says it has to be difficult? I only put that up there because it reminds me of a Mark Twain quote. Mark Twain, when he talked about raising children, giving advice on raising children, he said, when children are born, you need to put them in a barrel, feed them through a hole in the barrel, and when they turn 16, plug the hole. It's like, wow. So that's a pretty dramatic approach, obviously, to child rearing, but it does give us an idea of how difficult it can be. How many of you would say it did turn out to be considerably more difficult than I thought it would, or considerably different than I thought it would? Who'd be with me there? Yeah, we understand that. There are things you never even thought about that showed up. Things that you never, even though other people talked about their children, you didn't necessarily think about all the things that you would have to deal with in that life. And so James Dobson, writing on one occasion, was talking about a mother who said when she realized that motherhood was different than she anticipated. She said she came home one day. She said her 3 children and 3 of their friends were sitting in a circle in the living room floor. 6 of them sitting in a circle. And they seemed incredibly interested with something. So she crept slowly closer to them, trying to be quiet so they didn't see or hear her. And she said when she got close enough, she realized there were 6 baby skunks in the circle that they had closed off inside the house. And she panicked. She said, kids, run. She said, every kid grabbed a skunk and ran. She said, that's when I realized motherhood wasn't going to be exactly like I thought it was going to be. And so we mention that not because this class is mainly about raising the children, though we'll talk about a couple of those facets. This class is more about what do they do that affects the marriage relationship. Because that becomes very critical to us, and I think we'll see why in a minute. I would tell you, having children creates tension. There's no, and that doesn't mean that that's always bad, but tension just means the state of being stretched tight. We understand that as parents. Sometimes it's just pulling on us, mental or emotional strain. And as you see there, the one person who's talking about that said, a mind that is affected by stress or tension cannot think as clearly. We understand that. If you're under tension, a lot of pressure at your job, it is more difficult to process the information the way that you should. When I deal with married couples, one of the first things we deal with, and one of the reasons we deal with what we do, I can tell you, at least with the couples that I deal with, I'm talking about after marriage, not pre-marriage. After marriage, conflict resolution is probably the number one issue that we deal with. There's a lot of people who get married, they don't have conflict resolution skills. They don't, because conflict's going to happen. You can count on that, whether you have children or not. Conflict is going to happen. Some of them don't have the conflict resolution skills. Some of them don't have the communication skills. So those are the two things that seem to enter in the most. But one of the things I do with them is I have them have a sit-down talk at the first of every single week that they need to sit down with each other and they need to discuss what are the stressors in our life this week. What do we know is coming up? Because if you know there are things, maybe the kids have got 4 activities, and you know that's going to be a stressor. Maybe there's some kind of trip. Maybe the mother-in-law is coming to visit for a few days. You know, whatever the case is, there are things that are stressors. You know, one guy, he said, you want the definition of mixed emotions? He said, that's watching your mother-in-law drive your new car off the plane. He said, I don't know what to feel. So it's like, hopefully not quite that bad. But as you think about the stressors in life, children provide some of those stressors. What do you think the 3 major sources of conflict in marriage are? Because when surveys are done, it's the same 3 every time. Not always in the same order, but the same 3 pop up to the top 3 virtually every single time. What do you think causes most conflicts in marriage? Money. That's always one of the top 3. Finances. And we talked a little bit about, do we have a right view of finances? We talked about that a little bit last night because that's a huge cultural assault. What else?
Money, sex, and in-laws.
What's that?
Money, sex, and in-laws.
In-laws is actually 4. Yeah. But money and sex are 1 and 2, or 1 and 3, or 2 and 3. They're always in the top 3. So money, sex, intimacy in marriage, children. How to discipline, whether or not they can do certain things, how many are we going to have, whatever the case may be. Well, it's interesting, if you think in terms of that, we're talking about the stressors children put on marriage. They affect all 3. They are one of them, and they affect both of the other 2 in our life. And that's just the reality of it, and we understand that. So we want to look a little bit about that idea this morning as we talk about that. There was a project done over a 15-year period, a study that they studied kids for 15 years, the same kids, for 15 years as they were going through school. It was done by, as you can see, the Institute for Human Development. This professor and his wife put this whole thing together. They are both professors of psychology, and they came up with some conclusions after watching these kids for 15 years. They watched them for the entire time they were in school and for a couple years before they were in school. So they're watching these kids grow through virtually every phase of childhood. And here's what they found out. 92% of the parents said that there was a gradual increase in conflict after they had the first baby. Now, it doesn't mean they're having fights. It's just saying they noticed there was more conflict because there were now children in the home. That makes a difference. By the time their babies were 18 months old, almost 1 in 4 indicated their marriage was in distress. Again, not distress or despair to the point of giving up or divorcing. They're just saying they felt a very palpable tension at that point. That they struggled with a lot of issues at that point. And they found out that it is a cumulative erosion of satisfaction over time. Why do you think that even happens? Why is this cumulative erosion of our relationship? In other words, mine and my wife, yours and your wife, or you and your husband. Why is it a cumulative erosion of that relationship?
The minimization, the less time with each other.
Absolutely. Automatically less time with each other. That is going to happen whether you want it to or not. I mean, either that or you totally neglect the children, right? They take time, and they take more time at different parts of their life. So that's a part of that. Why else? When I have less time and I've now got children, how much more tired am I? You know, talk to I didn't understand that when we first had our kids, I can tell you. I worked full-time job. Judy's at home with 3 kids, 3.5 and under. That was the total span between our bottom and top. So 3.5 and under, she's home with 3. I was one of those husbands, you come home and you see stuff kind of scattered around the floor because, the kids have been playing all day, and I'm thinking, how can that be a mess? What else did you have to do today? Now, you learn not to vocalize that. Very quickly, you learn not to vocalize that. But there was a tendency for me not to recognize how incredibly exhausting that was to her to be raising children at home. And so because of that, I missed a lot of that point and how I could be more helpful in that. Because people spend less time, because they are more tired, we struggle. Here's what's important for you to remember. Remember your priority. And if you're looking at your sheets and filling those in by any chance, that happens to be way toward the end of this lesson as far as the blank. I think there's 3 remembers. I rearranged the lesson this morning after the sheets have been printed. So that first one, remember your priority. After God, your marriage, not your children, must be your priority 1 relationship. Must be. That is not only a suggestion, I would say that is absolutely God demanded of this relationship, husband and wife. And we know that because it is the only lifelong relationship that God expects you to have on earth. Husband and wife. Your children will not be a lifelong, they'll always be your children, don't get me wrong, but that will not be their priority relationship. When I do marriages for couples and do the ceremony, I have the couple turn and face their parents and say something to the effect of, let's just suppose the young girl's name is Barbara, and I'm saying, Barbara, starting today, you will no longer primarily be their daughter. You will primarily be this man's wife. And then I talk to the parents, and I say, today, Barbara will no longer primarily be your daughter. She will primarily be this man's wife. And they do the same thing with the husband and his parents. To try to get this concept in our minds of what relationship takes priority. And that the reason for that, because here's a quote I came across from somebody else. Couples should make the children the center of the home. After all, marriage may not last, they say, but you're a parent forever. I mean, that sounds not terribly bad. But that is absolutely against what God said when he created marriage in the beginning. And the whole idea was a man and a woman coming together for life. He says that has to be your priority relationship. And that becomes important because if you have 1 child, how many relationships exist in the home? Think about it. You didn't know it was going to be a math test today, did you? 6 relationships. I'll just give you the answer to that one because we'll do some more. 6 relationships in the home. In other words, there's my relationship to my wife's relationship to me, mine to my child's to me, Judy's to the child to Judy. Does that make sense? 6 individual relationships that exist in the home. 2 children, the relationships go up to 12. 3 children, they go up to 20. So you're now managing a home where there are 20 individual relationships that are being used within that home and that are going on. That in itself should help us to understand how complicated that process is and how hard I'm going to have to work to make sure that the primary relationship stays the primary relationship. That's not going to come easily. So we think in terms of the changes that happen, they're very fundamental. They shift maybe from wife to mother, and if I'm not careful or the mother's not careful, mother somehow becomes a very prime relationship instead of wife, or at the more intimate level, when you think in terms of from lovers to parents, and so the intimacy side of marriage starts to dwindle, and it's interesting because that's an absolute microcosm of the marriage. If intimacy in a marriage fails, you will watch the marriage continue to digress. It is a microcosm, and it's why God put us into the realm he did so that we could be fulfilled physically as well as emotionally. And so what happens is the arrival of children predicts less steady relationship automatically. Secondly, remember your purpose. Remember your purpose. What are you raising your kids for? Psalm 127 is such a great passage. It starts off by talking about children are heritage from the Lord. Well, it starts off by saying, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. But he goes on, when you get down a little bit further in there, he says, starting in verses 3 and 4, they're a gift from the Lord, they're a reward from him. And then he says, children born to a young man are like arrows in the hands of a warrior. You ever think about that analogy? This is God looking at us as parents and saying, I'm going to help you understand how to weaponize your children. I mean, what is the purpose of an arrow? What's the purpose of an arrow? Even Lord of the Ring fans? Legolas, I never understood where they kept replenishing themselves from. His quiver never ran out. But every arrow served a purpose, which was what? Not to stay in the quiver, was it? That's not the purpose of an arrow. The purpose of an arrow is to be launched, is it not? I would tell you, I think God is telling us with your children from the very start. That's what we need to understand about having children. My entire job as a parent is preparing them to be launched from my home so that they can continue another generation of bringing God glory. But launching them is not easy. And so we wrestle with that. But that is your purpose. Your purpose in having children, don't get me wrong, there's all kinds of benefits. He says they're a reward. I mean, there's incredible blessings of having children. But, back in my day, when there were no remotes, there were three TV channels and then a couple extra if you got UHF on your TV. But you had to go over and turn the dial. Anybody in here remember having to turn the dial on TV? See, children are a great benefit because if you're sitting there, you can say, hey, why don't you go change it to Channel 5, would you? That's not really good parenting. But I'm saying there are great benefits to having kids. We understand that. There are great benefits. But the purpose is not what I'm going to benefit from. That's a reward. You don't strive for the reward. You strive for the purpose. I think that's true, and we need to get that mentality even with Christianity. Sometimes you ask people, as a Christian, what's your goal? People will say heaven. I would tell you, heaven's not the goal that God ever established for you or me. Heaven is the reward. He says, you're not striving for heaven, you're striving to live a life that is pleasing to God. Paul said, as in all things we aim to please God. If I live a life pleasing to God, God says, here is your reward. He'll give me the blessing of heaven as a reward. Children are a reward, but their purpose is to be launched out into the world. So we need to make sure we always keep that in mind when we're talking about our children. So, and you think about the relationships that we have. Remember Jesus telling parables like the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who's looking for pearls. What happened to that merchant? Anybody remember? In the parable, what happened to that merchant that was looking for pearls?
He found a pearl of great price.
He found a pearl of great price or great value. And what did he do? Sold everything he had so he could buy the one pearl. Because the one pearl meant that much to him. I think he's telling me, when I look at my marriage, I need to understand that kind of value. That kind of value. Your spouse is like selling everything you have because you have the most valuable earthly relationship that can exist. And I know that because it is a relationship that points the world to Jesus Christ. Ephesians 5 tells me that. Paul talks about husbands loving your wives. He talks about wives submitting to your husbands. You get down to verses 31 and following, and he says the mystery is great, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. I can tell you, I've preached more marriage sermons out of Ephesians 5 than probably anything else out of there. I've heard more marriage sermons out of Ephesians 5 than probably anything else out of that passage. And yet Paul says, I'm not talking about marriage, primarily. I'm using marriage as an example to talk about Jesus and his people. And this is why that relationship, as we said last night, is so critical. My marriage should help point somebody to Jesus Christ. That's how important my relationship is. And they should see Jesus because of the relationship that I have. So what we're going to see in this lesson is children are budget busters. Big time. Now, you may instantly be thinking about finances. We're not even going there first. But they are there too. We'll talk about that. They bust every budget that you have. As we've already been talking, they bust the time budget. Would you agree with that? You can spend more time with your spouse before you have children than you can after? More individual time. Good relationship time. Yeah, absolutely. We understand that. It's just the numbers alone help us to see that. But you're going to have it. If it's the most important relationship, I need it. I need time with my wife. You need time with your spouse. God has created us that way. So that when we come together, we have that truly filling one another in that companionship. Or that word that God uses when he talks about that he created a woman to be a helpmeet. That Hebrew word azer, which is interesting because it's only used of a woman in that situation. Almost every other time azer, the Hebrew word, is used, it's used about God. God is our azer. So it's not talking about inferiority of role. It's talking about fulfillment of relationship. God fulfills in me every single thing I need. And he's saying that's what husbands and wives do to each other. It's like gears meshing to fill each other's needs. He says that's how important this is, and I cannot do that. We went through, I don't hear it as much these days as I used to, but used to hear people say, you know what, we don't get much time, but we get quality time. I'm a firm believer there's no such thing as quality without quantity. That doesn't mean you can't ever get quality moments, but I'm saying you can't spend, let me just put it this way. We spend about 3 hours a week in worship together in an assembly, right? 3, 4 maybe in a typical week. If that was all the time you spent with God, how good a relationship do you think you'd have with God? Poor. Be pretty poor, wouldn't it? Yeah, we need to spend a lot more time than that with God. Is that good time? Yeah, that's good time, and that's quality time. But that doesn't do it alone. You have to have time. And so lack of quality time causes this slow erosion of intimacy. We stop learning about each other and continuing to pursue one another. Anybody heard the term silver divorce? That's a relatively recent term, silver divorce, and it's referencing those couples who are divorcing after at least 25 years of marriage. That number is increasing exponentially in our country. Why do you think that happens? Because after the kids are out of the home, you're getting husbands and wives who realize we don't even know each other. And they have a hard time starting then to build that relationship. You need to take the time. That means to give you an example, I'm dealing with a couple right now. And we were talking about that the other day. They're getting almost no time together. I said, what time do your kids go to bed? Their kids are, I won't give you their exact ages. It's nobody you know anyway, but they're very early elementary school age. Matter of fact, one of them is probably pre-elementary school age. I said, what time do your kids go to bed? They said, 10 or 11. I thought, good grief. I understand. I come from a different generation than they do. My kids wouldn't have survived to teenage if they got to stay until 10 or 11. They went to bed. When do you get time together? If you work all day and your kids are up till 11, when do you get time together? I said, you guys got to find a way to get those kids in bed early because you have to make the time with each other. You may not always be able to check out, but you can always check in. In other words, you can't always get away. You know, you got one of the couples that I get to talk to regularly. They're not a problematic couple, but a couple that I spend time talking to. They talk about how hard it is now to get some vacation time. They have 4 kids, 4 girls, all young, and they talk about, you know how hard it is to escape for any measurable amount of time when you got 4 young kids? Well, yeah, I remember those days. You remember those days? That you can't just jump in the car and go wherever you want to go? You can't hop on a plane and fly somewhere? Hard to sometimes get away from everything, but you can always check in. Couples need to communicate regularly. Text each other. Stevie Wonder had a solution. Do you remember Stevie Wonder's solution? I just called to what? To say I love you. I just called to say I care. I'm telling you, that makes a difference. That makes a difference when you check in and just let somebody know that you're thinking about them. Not only that budget, they wreck the emotional budget big time. And I would tell you, this applies to those who no longer have children at home, but have grandchildren. Don't allow yourself, because you're grandparents, to be trapped into losing all your alone time taking care of your grandchildren. Help the parents find somebody else on occasion. You need time together as well. We've been caught in that trap before, and I would tell you, most grandparents I know have been caught in that trap, where you get pulled in because you want to help them and you want to do things, and all of a sudden you realize we're spending all our time doing grandchildren events. You need to be careful with that. They will take your time budget the same as they will take the parents. We need to understand this relationship, whether I'm a grandparent like I am now, or I was a parent before, this relationship here is still the primary relationship, and that's where my most efforts need to be put into. What happens emotional budget-wise? Everything's viewed differently when energy levels drop. We just don't see things the way that we normally do. And so we talk about children are a source of conflict in marriage. What do you think the conflict is about? What do you think the number one conflict is between husband and wife once they have children? Because the number one conflict doesn't even deal with the children. What do you think the number one conflict? That doesn't mean arguments, but something that now has to be done differently than it was before.
Financial.
Financial becomes one of those, but division of labor.
Intimacy.
Yeah, intimacy becomes one pretty shortly after that. When kids are first born and very young, intimacy is much easier between a married couple. Why? You don't have to lock the door. You don't have to worry about the child pounding on the door or anything else. You put the child down, they go to sleep. As they get older, that's a concern. You know, parents have to start locking the bedroom door if they're wanting to share some intimacy, because there's nothing to prevent your 12-year-old from just walking in. That, you know, locked doors mean something. You know, you've got to let them know that. But division of labor. Couples don't know what to do. We've got, I may get in trouble for telling this story, but I won't tell you who this is, but we've got somebody we were talking to, and they don't typically lock their doors at their own house, even if they go, because they have a one-bathroom house. They go in there, they don't necessarily lock the door because everybody in their household is old enough to know you knock on the door to see if anybody's in there, or you don't go in, they tell you. Well, this couple was on a vacation with their kids, and there were some other people who don't have the same rule. But they didn't lock the door, and this gentleman went in to take a shower. The little girl walks in who's not his, and just starts conversing to him through the glass door at the shower. It's like, "Hi, what's your name?" Well, it wasn't a matter of intimacy, but I'm saying all of a sudden you realize I can't function like I always functioned. And that causes an emotional stress. We need to think about that. And energy levels start to drop because I'm emotionally drained. We understand if we're not careful, you start getting some resentment and some neglect. One of them feels neglected and therefore resentful because of the lack of intimacy. The other person may feel neglected because they're not getting the help that they need, and they feel resentment because of that. It's so easy for that to go back and forth for between the two, and so you start getting that distance. They're just not spending the time together. I like the little boy Eddie, who was asked the question, how can a stranger tell if two people are married? His response was, married people usually look happy to talk to other people. That's kind of an interesting take on it. But are we talking to each other? Are we really pursuing that relationship the way that we pursued that relationship when we were dating each other? When we understood, I want to devote all my time, all my effort to this person. We need to certainly do that. Unhappy and unfulfilled parents are going to cause the children to grow up concluding that marriage is not a happy thing or place. I'm telling you, that makes a difference. We talked about how important it is we talk about our marriages the right way. I tell couples that I meet with, I said, you want to have a good exercise? Tell your children your love story. Not just once. Repeat that every once in a while. Just tell, hey, let me tell you how your mom and I fell in love. Let me tell you about the first time we met, or let me tell you about our first date, or let me tell you, whatever the case is. Talk to your children and reminisce about how wonderful that was, but make sure that it's not only that in the past. Make sure you talk to them about what yesterday was like with your wife, or yesterday was like with your husband, and how wonderful it is to be married, and how blessed you are by God to have the spouse that you have. We can appreciate the gift. Your spouse is a gift. Is she or is he not? From God? Your spouse, you consider your spouse a gift from God? So it's what are we going to do with that gift? Adam acknowledged that Eve was a gift. He just wasn't real happy with the gift at one point. Remember what he said? The woman that you gave me. He understood where she came from. God gave him. He's saying, I wouldn't be in this pickle except that the woman you gave me, well, that's not the way we want to think of this gift. I want to make sure my children understand what an incredible gift it is. And so it is critical to stay connected first with God through prayer and God's Word. However you do that, it is very critical to continue to pursue the relationship that you have with God. The best advice that you can ever give, that I can ever give any married couple is, strive to become the man that God wants you to be and the woman that God wants you to be. That's the task you're striving for. If you strive, and I'm trying as hard as I can to be the man of God that he wants me to be, and Judy's striving as hard as she can to be the woman of God that he wants her to be, you think we won't have a marriage that is blessed? There's no way to not have a blessed marriage if both people are striving that hard for godliness. It's when we get a little self-focused that we have a problem. So we need to spend time in prayer, asking God for help, asking God for direction, asking God for wisdom, which he says he freely gives. He'll give us that wisdom if we want it. We need to stay connected. As kids grow, that disconnect happens even more. Why do you think that is? Kids get older. Let's say your kids are now 12, 13, 14, in that range. You've got multiple children. Why does the disconnect grow even more between husband and wife? Well, that shouldn't be that hard of a question for people if you've got kids in that age group. How much more active is their life at 12 and 13 than it was at 4? You think in terms of, our three played Little League baseball. That was the only sport they played at that time. They played Little League baseball. All three boys playing Little League at the same time. All three just enough age difference to play in different divisions of the league. All right? When you were in Florida, they had as 12, 10, and 9 at that time. 12, 10, and 9, these three ages. They had a 52-game season. Now, I'm just telling you. You also had practice, don't forget. Practice at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. All of a sudden you realize you don't have any time at all. I'll come back to that in a minute, but we understand our time as they get older is even more of a disconnect because they grow more independent. They have a tendency as they get a little bit older to grow more rebellious. They're going to stand up in different ways that make it hard and drain those emotional energy levels that we have, and we need to make sure with each other. Stay connected with each other. That is absolutely key. I'll hit that point in the next lesson when we talk about the idea of connection. But I would tell you it takes preparation and it takes work. It takes work. The most common phrase I hear from couples when I'm talking to them before marriage and after both, there's a whole generation of people who are constantly saying to me, we just want things to happen organically. You ever had anybody talk about organic life? Just want it to happen organically. It doesn't happen organically unless you work at making it happen organically. If it becomes who you are because you have disciplined yourself to do that, then things become organic. They don't just happen on their own. It takes work, it takes preparation to have that relationship. And children will drain that, but then they drain the financial budget as well. Achieving balance is the key. They need to learn that they cannot have everything that they want. That budgets are necessary and that budgets work. And they need to learn how to prioritize things. I was telling Tim before class, and I didn't mention this last night, but Tim's an old rock and roll buddy from the 70s. We played in a rock band together, so if he doesn't look like a rocker to you, he was a drummer pretty extraordinaire. And with the, you've probably heard of it, world famous for Daddy Mag and the Crumb Spinners. But I was talking to him before and I said, financially, here's what our oldest son told his two brothers. He was married, they were not yet married. And I thought, I got to listen to this because he said, I'm going to give you the best piece of marriage advice you'll ever get. I thought, this could be interesting. You know, because he'd been married probably 2 years by that time. I was going to give him the best piece of marriage advice they were ever going to get. He said, buy everything you want now because you're getting nothing afterwards. So, he was the spender, in case you didn't pick up on that, from the three that I mentioned last night, who married the frugal wife. So that has been to his disdain sometimes that he can't have all that. But kids need to learn that pretty early. I like what one parent, I really appreciate this because my boys would ask us something like, Dad, can we do this? Can we go here? You ever tell your child, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. And then father one time said, I don't ever respond to my children that way, or very rarely. There are times that I can, and legitimately. He said, but most often I respond as honestly as I can and say, yes, we can do that, but we're not going to. Because we have more important things that we have to dedicate that money to. It isn't a matter of we don't have the ability. I want my children to understand that certain things have a higher priority in life than others. And so helping them to grasp that message is a big help as well. And so we've got to achieve that balance. And your child's involvement in life will directly affect all three. It is important to understand your children do not, in order to be serving God all through their life, even in their childhood, do not need to be able to be involved in 3 sports, play 2 musical instruments, be involved in drama in the chess club. You can over-activity your children, and you will suffer for that. It is important to understand balance has to be maintained. And if you're like me, I would tell you it is the single hardest thing in life to maintain, period. Balance. True balance in all areas of life. Balance. And we need to help our children to do that. Don't know where you are in your life right now, but I came across a book years ago called The 2-Degree Difference. Anybody ever heard of that book? Dr. John Trent wrote it. The 2-Degree Difference. How small things can change everything. Anybody in here golf? You see a hand if somebody golfs. Hit the ball perfectly straight. And so how far off course does it have to be when it's a foot away from the tee to be 50 yards off course by the time it lands? I mean, it doesn't start 50 yards off. It starts like this. And you just keep watching. You're thinking, oh, look, straight for the trees, oh, over the trees, whatever the case is. 2 degrees makes a big difference when you play it all the way out, doesn't it? Make small changes now. Make small changes now to help your children to understand that. It is possible with children to have strong, healthy, yes, even blissful marriages. We just need to remember that that is not a natural consequence of having children. Having children goes directly against those things if we don't work hard to prevent it from happening. Children can assault us. All 3 of those budgets. Important that you work on all of those because they will affect all 3. And then finally, your last point on that lesson, I think, is remember your promise. Remember your promise. Here's what God said when he created marriage. You're going to leave father and mother. You're going to hold fast to your spouse. You are going to become one flesh, and you're going to be open and vulnerable with one another. That was the whole concept of naked and ashamed. Naked and ashamed. They were both naked and not ashamed. And so there's that vulnerability and that openness with one another in Genesis chapter 2. If you got married like I did, where a preacher was making statements to you and you were responding, I made some pretty serious promises to God. and to my spouse the day I got married. And God says in Deuteronomy chapter 23, I will take that seriously. He said, nobody made you do that. That's what he says in Deuteronomy 23. You voluntarily vowed with your own lips, he says. I did that. I'll leave you with this story, and then we'll take a break for a few minutes before the next class. Several in here know Melvin Curry. People in here know Melvin? You remember Melvin Curry? Well, I said that like he's passed, but he hasn't. He was a teacher at SC when I was there years ago. That's got to be at least 25 years ago when I was in college. No, Melvin was a teacher there, and he came to our wedding because Judy grew up with his family. They all knew her. She was best friends with his daughter. And he's not a very big guy, but he was a Golden Gloves boxer. And even at his diminutive size, he could be a pretty intimidating person. I was a new Christian when I got married. And there were a lot of people in Judy's life that wondered if she had made the right selection or not. I've never gone back to quiz them about that later because I don't necessarily want to know if they've changed their mind. But he knew her well. And I'm at my reception, and he comes up and he taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around and I said, yeah, Brother Kirk. He goes, did you hear what you said? About like that. And I'm telling you, I'm trembling already. And I'm thinking, I'm playing through my mind the conversation I was having with this person at my reception. Because I used to use foul language. Before I was a Christian, I was trying to correct all of that, but I thought, surely I didn't slip and curse at my own reception. I don't remember saying anything like that. And I said, I'm sorry, Brother Curry, I don't understand. And he said, did you hear what you said? So I'm playing it all through my mind again. I thought, well, Christians aren't supposed to gossip. Maybe I was talking about somebody and I shouldn't have been talking about them. And I turned around again and I said, Brother Curry, I'm sorry, I don't understand. He said, when you were up front and the preacher was asking you those questions and you responded the way you did you hear what you said? He said, because I did, and I will hold you to it. I got to tell you, I appreciate that in him. That was 47 years ago. And I'm still looking over my shoulder. Always wondering, is Melvin back there? Not back there. No, we have a great relationship, but I'm telling you, that made a difference. All he was saying was, understand, as a Christian, you made some promises. Remember your promise. This relationship, husband and wife, the primary relationship on earth. Not in the world. God first, spouse second. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate that. We will take a break. Be best if you can come back in probably about 5 till 3.